I didn't cry at my husband's funeral, not when they lowered the casket, not when the last hymn faded, not even when my son placed a stack of papers into my hands and told me, "Mom, you need to sign these before we leave." I remember the way the paper felt, smooth and cold against my fingers, as if it had been waiting for me long before that moment, as if everything had already been decided and I was the last one to know. I looked at Daniel, searching his face for something familiar, something that belonged to the boy who used to hold my hand when he was afraid of thunderstorms, but he wouldn't meet my eyes, and instead it was Olivia who stepped slightly closer, her voice soft but firm, saying, "It's just standard paperwork, Margaret, nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about. The words settled strangely in my chest, heavier than grief, sharper than the quiet ache that had followed me all morning. The church smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, and people were still gathered in small clusters behind us, whispering condolences, dabbing their eyes, pretending not to watch. I glanced down at the first page, expecting to see something simple, something administrative, but the language was dense, formal, unfamiliar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I read the first paragraph once, slowly, my eyes tracing each line, and then I read it again because something didn't make sense. My name was there, but not in the way I expected. It appeared in a sentence that felt final. Removed. I blinked, adjusting my glasses, thinking perhaps I had misunderstood, that grief was clouding my mind, that I just needed a moment to steady myself. Around me, chairs scraped softly against the floor as people began to leave, the low hum of conversation rising and falling like distant waves. Daniel shifted his weight beside me, impatient or maybe just uncomfortable, I couldn't tell anymore, and Olivia gave him a quick look, the kind that passed between them without words. I noticed that. I noticed everything, even though part of me felt like I was standing outside my own body, watching this scene unfold as if it belonged to someone else. I turned the page. The second paragraph was clearer. Too clear. It spoke about property, ownership, transfer of rights, phrases that felt out of place in a church, at a funeral, in my hands. I read it once and then I read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle, letting the meaning form whether I wanted it to or not. My heart didn't race. It didn't shatter. It simply slowed, like something inside me was pausing, recalibrating, refusing to react too quickly. I lifted my head and looked at Daniel again. Really looked this time, and for a brief second I saw something flicker across his face, something uncertain, almost like he was waiting for me to say something, to question him, to protest. But I didn't. I just held the papers a little tighter and gave a small, quiet nod, as if I understood, as if everything made perfect sense. Because in that moment, standing there with the scent of flowers and loss in the air, I realized something far heavier than grief. These were not funeral papers. And whatever they meant, whatever they were trying to take from me, it hadn't started today. I did not sign anything that day, not at the church, not in front of Daniel or Olivia, and not when Olivia gently reminded me that it would be easier if everything was handled right away, because I simply folded the papers, placed them back into the envelope, and said I needed time, my voice calm, almost distant, as if I were discussing something as ordinary as a grocery list instead of the quiet unraveling of my life. Daniel hesitated, just for a moment, as though he wanted to object, but Olivia touched his arm lightly, and that was enough. He nodded and said, "Of course, Mom, take your time." Though the words felt rehearsed, like something he had already practiced saying before we ever stepped into that church, the drive home was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, heavy and suffocating, and I watched the passing streets through the window, the familiar houses, the small park where Daniel used to play Little League, the grocery store where I had shopped every Saturday for 30 years, all of it still there, unchanged, while something fundamental had shifted beneath my feet. When we pulled into the driveway, Olivia was the first to step out, already checking her phone, already moving ahead as if the day were simply another task to complete, and Daniel lingered for a second before following her, leaving me alone in the back seat with the envelope resting in my lap. The house greeted me with a stillness that felt different now. Not just empty, but observant, as if it were waiting to see what I would do next, and I walked inside slowly, setting my purse down on the same table where it had sat for years, where everything had once felt certain and secure. I did not take off my coat right away. I did not turn on the lights, I just stood there, holding that envelope, feeling its weight again, heavier now than it had been at the church, as if it had absorbed the truth I had only begun to understand. Eventually, I moved to the kitchen, placed the envelope on the counter, and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady, my breathing even, because there was no room for panic, not yet. Panic would only cloud what I needed to see clearly. I sat down at the table and opened the envelope once more, smoothing the papers out in front of me, reading them again from the beginning, slower this time, more carefully, noticing the details I had missed before, the dates, the signatures, the language that had seemed confusing at first but now revealed its meaning piece by piece. There were transfers I did not remember approving, changes made weeks before my husband passed, clauses that shifted ownership in ways that felt deliberate, calculated, and I realized that whatever this was, it had not been done in a single moment of grief or confusion. It had been planned, structured, executed with precision. I thought about the last few months, about the way Olivia had started handling more of the bills, how she had insisted it was to help me, how Daniel had agreed without question, how certain documents had been placed in front of me to sign when I was tired, distracted, trusting, always trusting, and I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not yet, but clarity, a quiet, steady clarity that replaced the fog I had been living in. I looked at my name again on those pages, at the way it appeared and disappeared in the legal language, and I understood that this was not just about paperwork, it was about control, about erasing me from decisions that had once been mine, about rewriting a life I had spent decades building. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the kitchen floor, long and golden, the kind of light that usually felt warm, comforting, but now it only made the room feel larger, emptier, and I sat there reading those pages again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain, because I needed to see every detail, every intention, every quiet betrayal hidden between the lines. By the time I reached the last page, I did not feel confused anymore. I did not feel uncertain. I felt aware, fully aware. And that awareness changed everything, because for the first time since my husband passed, I was not just grieving, I was paying attention. The next morning arrived quietly, almost politely, as if nothing had changed, as if the world had not shifted beneath my feet the day before. And I followed my usual routine with a precision that surprised even me. I made coffee, measured exactly 2 scoops the way my husband liked it, even though he was no longer there to drink it, and I placed his mug on the counter beside mine out of habit before realizing what I had done. But I did not move it right away. I let it sit there, a small reminder of the life that had existed before everything became uncertain. The envelope remained on the kitchen table where I had left it, untouched since the night before, and yet I could feel its presence in the room, like a quiet observer, waiting for me to return to it. But instead of opening it again, I sat down with my coffee and allowed my mind to move backward, retracing the last few months with a clarity I had not had before. It was strange how things that once seemed ordinary now stood require proof. I remembered signing a few papers at the dining room table, nothing urgent, nothing that raised alarms, just small things, updates, adjustments, or at least that was how they had been presented to me. And I had signed them without reading every line, because grief had already begun to settle into my bones, because I was tired, because I thought there was no reason to question my own family. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue, grounding me in the present, and I realized that trust, once given so freely, had been used in ways I had never considered. Outside, the neighborhood moved on as it always did. A car passed by, a dog barked somewhere in the distance, and sunlight filtered through the window, casting soft patterns across the table. But inside this house, everything felt different, not broken, not yet, but rearranged in a way that no longer included me in the center. I stood up and walked to the living room, my steps steady, my breathing even, and I looked around at the furniture, the photographs, the small details that had once told the story of our life together, and I wondered how long those things had been quietly shifting out of my control. My gaze stopped on a framed picture of Daniel as a child, standing in the backyard with a baseball glove too big for his hands, smiling up at the camera with complete trust, and I felt a brief flicker of something I could not quite name, not anger, not sadness, but something deeper, something that acknowledged the distance between who he had been and who he was now. I returned to the kitchen and finally picked up the envelope again, not with hesitation but with purpose, because I understood now that what I held in my hands was not just a set of documents, it was evidence of a process that had been unfolding quietly, carefully, while I was looking the other way. I did not rush this time. I did not skim. I read each page slowly, deliberately, allowing every word to settle into place, and with each line the pattern became clearer, the intention more visible, until there was no room left for doubt. By the time I reached the final page, I no longer felt like someone who had been caught off guard. I felt like someone who had finally seen the full picture, And once you see something that clearly, you cannot pretend it does not exist, you cannot go back to not knowing. And in that moment I made a quiet decision, one that did not require words, one that did not need to be shared with anyone else, because for the first time I was not reacting to what had been done to me, I was preparing for what I would do next. It was not anger that guided me that morning, it was something quieter, something far more dangerous, a kind of stillness that allowed me to see clearly without being clouded by emotion. And as I sat there with those papers spread across the table, I began to notice details I had overlooked before, not just in the documents, but in the way everything had been arranged, the timing, the sequence, the careful steps that had led to this moment. I traced the dates again with my finger, noticing how certain changes had been made just weeks apart, each one small enough to seem insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern that was anything but accidental. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet where we kept the old filing boxes, the ones my husband had always insisted on organizing himself, and I pulled one down, setting it on the dining room table with a soft thud, dust rising slightly into the air. Inside were years of records, neatly labeled, his handwriting steady and familiar, and I felt a brief sense of comfort seeing it, as if he had left behind a map, something that could guide me now. I began going through the folders slowly, methodically, comparing what I held in my hands with what had existed before, and it did not take long for the differences to become obvious. Certain documents were missing, others had been replaced, and some had been altered in ways that were subtle but significant. I paused when I found a copy of an earlier property agreement, one that clearly listed both of our names, equal ownership, equal authority, and I placed it beside the newer version from the envelope, the contrast unmistakable, my name reduced, repositioned, nearly erased from sections where it had once been central. I did not feel shock anymore, that had already passed. What I felt now was confirmation, the quiet realization that what had happened was not confusion or misunderstanding, it was intentional. I thought about Olivia again, about the way she had positioned herself over the past year, always helpful, always organized, always one step ahead. And I remembered how she had started answering questions before Daniel could, how she had gradually become the one who explained things to me, simplified things for me, as if I were no longer capable of understanding my own life. I remembered the subtle shifts in tone, the gentle corrections, the way she would say, "It is easier this way," and how I had accepted that because it seemed reasonable, because it seemed kind. I closed the filing box and rested my hands on the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath my palms, grounding myself again, and I realized that this was not just about documents or signatures, it was about being moved aside, quietly, efficiently, without confrontation, without a single raised voice. I walked to the window and looked out at the yard, the same yard I had tended for decades, the same garden beds my husband and I had planted together, and I wondered how long they had believed I would not notice, how long they had counted on my silence, my trust, my grief. The answer came to me without effort. They believed I would never question it at all. I turned back toward the table, toward the papers, and something settled firmly inside me. Not a decision made in haste, but one formed with clarity and patience, because I understood now that reacting too quickly would only play into their expectations. It would confirm exactly what they assumed about me. Instead, I gathered the documents neatly, placed them back into the envelope, and set it aside with care, as if it were nothing more than a routine matter, because for now, that was what they needed to believe. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, turning on lights, straightening small things that did not need straightening, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, because beneath that surface, something had shifted, something that could not be undone. And as I paused in the doorway of the living room, looking at the quiet space that had once been filled with laughter and conversation, I understood one thing with complete certainty. They thought this was the end of something, but for me it was only the beginning. By the afternoon, the house no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a stage, and I understood that every movement I made, every word I chose, would either confirm their expectations or quietly disrupt them. So I chose carefully, deliberately, the way one does when stepping onto unfamiliar ground. I picked up the phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in months, perhaps even longer. Harold Bennett, my husband's attorney for over 20 years, a man who had always spoken plainly, who had never once treated me as if I did not belong in the room when decisions were made. I let the phone ring twice before he answered, his voice steady, familiar, and when I told him who I was, there was a pause, not of confusion but of recognition, as if he already understood that a call from me at this moment could only mean one thing. I did not explain everything right away. I did not accuse. I simply asked if he had time to review some documents with me, and there was something in my tone that made him respond without hesitation. "Come by this afternoon," he said. "Bring everything you have." I arrived at his office just before 3, the same office I had visited years ago with my husband, back when decisions were shared, when conversations included me without question, and as I stepped inside, I felt that same quiet shift within me, not returning to who I had been, but reclaiming something I had allowed to be taken. Harold greeted me at the door, his expression warm but attentive, and as we sat down across from each other, I placed the envelope on his desk and slid it toward him without a word. He opened it slowly, reading each page with a focus that did not waver, and I watched him the way I had watched everything else, carefully, noting the slight tightening around his eyes, the way he adjusted his glasses, the pause that lingered just a second too long on certain lines. He did not speak immediately when he finished. He simply placed the papers down and folded his hands, looking at me in a way that told me everything I needed to know before he even said a word. "Margaret," he began, his voice measured, "these changes should not have been processed without a full review, and certainly not without your clear understanding and consent." And there it was, not a question, not a possibility, but confirmation. I nodded once slowly because I had already reached that conclusion myself, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it weight, gave it shape, turned it from suspicion into fact. I asked him how long these changes had been in place, and he pointed to the dates, explaining them in a way that aligned perfectly with what I had begun to piece together on my own, each adjustment building upon the last, each step designed to appear harmless until it was too late to see the full picture at once. I did not interrupt him, I did not react outwardly, but inside, something settled even deeper, something firm and unshakable, because now I knew that this was not just something I had imagined, it was real, structured, and deliberate. When he finished, I asked one final question, my voice calm, almost conversational. "Can it be undone?" And Harold did not answer immediately, but the look he gave me told me that the answer was not simple, that it would require time, precision, and a careful approach. I leaned back slightly in my chair, considering that, letting it settle, because I understood now that this was not a moment for confrontation, not yet. This was a moment for preparation. I gathered the papers once more, sliding them back into the envelope with the same quiet care I had used before, and as I stood to leave, Harold said, "Do not sign anything else and do not let them rush you." And I gave him a small nod, because rushing was exactly what they were counting on. When I stepped back outside into the late afternoon light, the air felt different, not lighter but clearer, and as I walked to my car, I realized that for the first time since that moment at the church, I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was beginning to understand how to respond, and that changed everything. That evening, I returned home at the same hour I always did, as if nothing had changed, as if the day had been ordinary, and I placed my keys in the same dish by the door, hung my coat in the same place, moved through the house with the same quiet routine they had come to expect from me, because routine can be a powerful disguise when used correctly. I heard their voices before I saw them, low and casual in the living room, Daniel speaking about something trivial, Olivia responding with that calm certainty she always carried, and when I stepped into the room, both of them looked up at the same time, their expressions shifting almost instantly into something softer, something more careful. "Mom, you are back," Daniel said, standing halfway as if unsure whether to approach me or stay where he was, and I gave him a small, polite smile, the kind that revealed nothing, the kind that neither invited nor rejected, simply existed. Olivia watched me more closely, her eyes scanning my face, searching for something, a reaction perhaps, a sign that I had read too much, understood too much, but I offered her nothing, not a single clue. "I stopped by the bank," I said lightly, setting my purse down, letting the words hang in the air just long enough to be noticed, and I saw it then, the brief flicker of tension that passed between them, quick, almost invisible, but it was there. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, too quickly, his voice carrying a note of concern that felt practiced rather than genuine, and I nodded once calmly. "Everything is fine," I replied, and that was the truth, just not in the way they assumed. I moved past them into the kitchen, taking my time, pouring a glass of water, allowing the silence behind me to stretch, to settle, to make them wonder what I might say next. But I said nothing more because silence, I was beginning to understand, could be far more unsettling than any accusation. A few minutes later, Olivia joined me, leaning lightly against the counter as if this were an ordinary conversation. as if we were discussing dinner plans instead of the quiet rearrangement of my life. "Did you have a chance to look over the documents?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral, and I turned to her with the same composed expression I had worn all day. "I did," I said simply and waited. She held my gaze for a moment, measuring, calculating, and then she smiled just slightly. "And," she prompted, "and?" I allowed a small pause before answering. "They are very thorough," I said, choosing each word with care, watching how she processed it, how she relaxed just a fraction, interpreting my calm as compliance. Daniel stepped into the doorway then, drawn by the conversation, and I shifted my attention to him, softening my expression just enough to feel familiar. "Your father always believed in having things organized," I added, and that seemed to settle something in him, as if he needed reassurance that I was still seeing this through the lens he expected. We stood there for a moment, the three of us, in a space that suddenly felt much smaller than it had that morning, and I realized how easily they had assumed I would follow a certain path, how confidently they had expected me to react in predictable ways, to ask questions, to show confusion, to rely on them for explanations. Instead, I had done none of those things, and that, more than anything else, was beginning to shift the balance. I picked up my glass and took a slow sip, letting the quiet stretch again, letting them sit with their own assumptions, and then I said almost casually, "I will review everything again tomorrow before I sign anything." And there it was, the smallest change, the slightest delay, but it landed with weight because I saw it in their faces, the subtle tightening, the shared glance, the realization that I was not moving as quickly as they had planned. I turned away before either of them could respond, carrying my glass to the sink, rinsing it carefully, methodically, as if this were just another evening, just another routine, but inside everything was aligned now, every piece in its place, and for the first time I understood exactly where I stood, and more importantly where they thought I stood, and that difference was where my advantage began. The next day, I did not wait for them to bring up the papers again. I let the morning unfold slowly, deliberately, the same way I had always done. I made breakfast, set the table, even placed an extra plate out of habit before quietly removing it, and when Daniel walked into the kitchen, he paused for a moment as if something about the scene felt familiar enough to be comforting but different enough to make him uneasy. "You are up early," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes searching, always searching now, and I gave him a small nod as I poured coffee into my cup. "I have always been," I replied, keeping my tone light, steady, leaving no space for him to read anything more into it. Olivia joined us shortly after, her movements precise, her expression composed, but I could see it in the way she held her shoulders just slightly tense, just enough to tell me that she was waiting, that both of them were waiting for me to say something about the documents, to ask questions, to show confusion, to follow the script they had already written in their minds. Instead, I sat down at the table and began eating as if nothing had changed, as if this were just another ordinary morning, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was charged, filled with everything that was not being said. "Did you get a chance to look at everything again?" Olivia asked finally, her voice smooth, carefully measured, and I set my fork down gently, taking a moment before answering, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted the pause itself to mean something. "I did," I said, meeting her gaze directly this time, holding it just long enough to make her uncomfortable, and then I added, "There are a few things I would like clarified before I sign." And that was when it happened, not a dramatic reaction, not an argument, just a subtle shift, a tightening of the air. Daniel's hand stilling on his coffee mug, Olivia's smile holding just a second too long. "Of course," she said quickly, too quickly. "What would you like to go over?" And I could hear it now, the faint edge beneath her calm tone, the careful control she was trying to maintain. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, not defensive, not aggressive, simply present. "I think it would be best if we reviewed everything with Mr. Bennett," I said, letting the name settle between us, watching how it landed, because I knew it would change everything. Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a moment, confusion or perhaps concern, but Olivia was the one who reacted more visibly, her posture stiffening ever so slightly, her gaze sharpening as she processed what I had just said. "That might not be necessary," she replied, her voice still calm but firmer now, as if trying to steer the conversation back into familiar territory. "These are standard documents, Margaret, we can go over them together." And I smiled then, not warmly, not coldly, just enough to acknowledge her words without agreeing to them. "I am sure we can," I said, "but I would feel more comfortable having everything reviewed properly." And I held her gaze again, steady, unwavering, letting her see that this was Not a suggestion, not something that could be redirected or dismissed. Daniel shifted in his seat, looking between us, caught in a space he did not fully understand, and for the first time, I saw something different in his expression, not certainty, not confidence, but doubt, small, fragile, but present. The conversation did not escalate. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a quiet recalibration of expectations, and I could feel it, the subtle shift in control, the moment where their certainty began to fracture. I picked up my fork again and continued eating, as if nothing significant had just occurred, because on the surface it had not, but beneath that surface everything had changed, and as I sat there, moving through the motions of an ordinary morning, I understood something with complete clarity. They had planned every step assuming I would remain passive, assuming I would follow, assuming I would not question, and now for the first time they were beginning to realize that I was not where they thought I was, and that uncertainty was something they were not prepared for. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, and I made sure to mention it casually, almost as an afterthought, as if it were a minor detail rather than the quiet turning point it truly was, and I watched carefully as Olivia absorbed the information, her expression controlled, her posture still, but there was a shift there, subtle but undeniable, like a surface that had just begun to crack beneath pressure. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed uncertain, his gaze moving between us as if trying to understand a conversation that had already moved beyond him, and I realized then how much of this had been orchestrated without his full awareness, how easily he had followed a path that had been laid out for him step by step. The hours leading up to the meeting passed with a strange calm, the kind that comes not from ignorance but from clarity, and I moved through the house as I always did, folding laundry, watering the plants, maintaining the rhythm of a life that appeared unchanged, because the appearance of normalcy was now something I used with intention. When it was time to leave, I did not rush. I took my coat, checked my purse, and walked to the door without looking back, because I knew they were watching, measuring, trying to anticipate what I might do next, and the less I revealed, the more uncertain they would become. Harold's office felt different this time, not because it had changed, but because I had, and when we sat down together again, I noticed that he had already prepared additional documents, his expression more serious now, more focused, as if he had spent the previous evening tracing the same patterns I had begun to see. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, alone, and that alone told me more than anything he could have said, because Olivia's absence was not an accident, it was a choice, a calculated decision to let him stand in a space he did not fully understand. He looked uncomfortable as he sat down, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, and when Harold began to speak, explaining the discrepancies, the inconsistencies, the way certain changes had been processed, I watched Daniel's face carefully, not with judgment, but with a kind of distant observation, noting each reaction as it surfaced. Confusion came first, then disbelief, and finally a slow realization that settled in as Harold pointed out the specific details, the signatures, the timing, the way everything had been structured to appear legitimate while quietly shifting control. "I did not know," Daniel said at one point, his voice low, almost defensive, and I believed him, not completely, but enough to understand that his role in this was not as deliberate as Olivia's, that he had been guided, influenced, perhaps even convinced that everything was being done for the right reasons. I did not respond immediately. I let his words sit there, unchallenged, because this was not the moment for confrontation, it was the moment for clarity, for letting the truth reveal itself without interruption. Harold continued, outlining the options, the possible steps forward, the ways in which certain actions could be reviewed, potentially reversed, but only with careful handling, with patience, with precision, and as I listened, I felt that same quiet steadiness settle deeper within me, the certainty that had been building since the moment I first read those papers. When the explanation was complete, the room fell into a brief silence, and I turned to Daniel, meeting his eyes fully this time, not searching, not questioning, simply present, and in that moment, he looked different to me, not as my son, not as the boy in the photograph, but as a man standing at the edge of something he had not expected to face. I gathered the documents slowly, placing them back into the folder with deliberate care, and I spoke then, my voice calm, even leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Nothing will be signed today," I said, and that was all, no anger, no accusation, just a boundary, clear and immovable, and as I stood to leave, I understood that whatever came next would not be rushed, would not be forced. It would unfold on my terms in my time, and that was something they had not planned for. When we returned home, the house felt different again, not because anything had physically changed, but because something unspoken had shifted between us, something that could not be undone now that it had been seen, understood, and acknowledged. Daniel moved through the space more quietly than usual, his steps slower, his presence less certain, as if he were no longer sure where he stood or what he was supposed to do next, and I noticed how he avoided looking directly at me, how his eyes lingered instead on small, unimportant things, the edge of the table, the pattern on the rug, anything that did not require him to confront what had just happened. Olivia arrived shortly after, her entrance as composed as ever, her expression controlled, but there was a tension in the way she carried herself, a subtle rigidity that had not been there before, and when her eyes met mine there was no warmth, no pretense of softness, only calculation, sharp and immediate, as if she were already adjusting her strategy, already searching for a new path forward. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice even, measured, and Daniel hesitated before answering, glancing at me briefly as if unsure whether he should speak at all. But I did not step in, I did not fill the silence, I let him respond on his own, because this was no longer something I needed to manage for him. "We are not signing anything," he said finally, his tone uncertain, and I saw it then, the flicker of something in Olivia's eyes, not surprise, not exactly, but irritation, controlled and contained, quickly replaced by a calm expression that might have fooled anyone who was not paying close attention. "There must be some misunderstanding," she replied smoothly, stepping further into the room, her voice carrying that same practiced reassurance, but it no longer had the same effect, not on me, not anymore. I remained where I was, standing near the window, the late afternoon light falling across the floor in long, quiet lines, and I spoke only when the silence had stretched long enough to settle. "There is no misunderstanding," I said, my voice calm, steady, leaving no space for interpretation, and I watched as the words landed, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a weight that could not be dismissed. Olivia held my gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then she shifted her attention to Daniel as if recalculating, as if deciding whether to push further or step back, and in that moment, I understood something with complete clarity. This had never been about a single conversation, a single set of documents, or even a single decision. It had been about control, about shaping the narrative quietly over time, and now that narrative had been interrupted. Daniel spoke again, more firmly this time, repeating what had already been said, and I could see the tension in his posture, the uncertainty, but also the beginning of something else, something that had not been there before, the realization that he was no longer simply following along. I did not raise my voice, I did not argue, I did not need to, because everything that needed to be said had already been made clear, and sometimes clarity, delivered without emotion, is more powerful than any confrontation. The room fell quiet again, and this time it stayed that way, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to pretend. I turned slightly, looking out at the yard, at the familiar space that had once felt entirely mine, and I felt that same steady certainty settle into place, stronger now, more defined, because I understood not only what had been done, but what would come next. I was no longer reacting, no longer trying to understand what had already happened. I was moving forward with intention, with patience, with a clarity they had not expected, and as I stood there in the fading light, I realized that they had believed this moment would mark the end of my place in this house, in this life, but instead, it had marked the beginning of something they were not prepared for, because I had let them believe I was still grieving, still uncertain, still willing to follow, and that, more than anything else, was their first mistake.